a lot of people don't know the truth. A lot of people don't know the true part, the true story, the true Canadian story, all warts and all. You know, a lot of people know the mystical Canadian dream of multiculturalism and inclusion, but there's a history of racism in this country that we need to acknowledge.
And people would talk about history, but when they would talk about that history, people often talked about them in hushed tones, and they talked about them quietly, and they'd often say, well, yeah, I'm going to tell you this, but don't go around talking about it.
It's the ground we stand on, figuratively and literally, in talking about land and people's attitudes of how do Canadians feel about living on somebody else's land? Well, we don't like to think about it.
I went to the same grade school that my mom went to, so it's an old one. It's been around for over 100 years, and she remembers that when she was a girl living in the village, that there were Mi'kmaq living there. And I was fascinated with this. Really? Like the people who lived in the forest, like they were living there in our village? Like when you were a girl? Yeah. So my next question, of course, is what happened to them? Where are they? Why did they go? And I didn't really feel I got a complete answer to that question.
Thinking about that question, what is colonialism? And I think a lot in French. The idea of les colons, it truly is tied to questions of land, right? Colonialism is appropriation of land and rebuilding of land that's often based on doctrines of discovery, or the idea that there is no prior occupation.
Over the past 200 years, and really the most intense degradation has occurred since the 1940s, which is in the lifespan of our old people. Without our permission and without our consent, we have been systemically removed and dispossessed of most of our territory. We have fought back as our homeland has been stolen, clear-cut, subdivided and sold to settlers from Europe and later cottagers from Toronto. The last salmon navigated our waters about 100 years ago. We no longer have eels or salmon in our territory. We no longer have old-growth white pine forests. Our rice beds were nearly destroyed. All but one tiny piece of prairie that exists on my reserve in Alderville has been destroyed. 90% of our sugar bushes are under private ownership. Our most sacred spaces have been made into provincial parks for tourists with concrete buildings on our teaching rocks. Our burial grounds, our mounds, have cottages built on top of them. The veins of our mother have lift locks blocking them, and the shores of nearly every one of our lakes and rivers has a cottages or a home, making it nearly impossible for us to launch a canoe. Our rice has nearly been destroyed by raised water levels from the Trent Severn waterway, boat traffic, and sewage from the cottages. Our children have been taken away and sent to residential schools, day schools, and now an education system that refuses to acknowledge our culture, our knowledge, our history, and Indigenous experience.
I grew up in a non-Native family. I was adopted into a settler family. My grandparents are from a family that have a heritage homestead. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of the homestead 2 years ago, on both my adopted father and adopted mother's sides. And I grew up within that atmosphere, farming, and actually learned a lot from my grandpa about, as a newcomer, he had a deep appreciation for the land that he lived. And, it was one of those interesting histories where I'm learning about this, the settler perspective and the love of the land and, coming there, but my family not really having, or not wanting to think about how it is they came to have the land that they had. right? Even though my grandpa would go out and he would find arrowheads and he would find stone tools on his land, acknowledged it, but didn't take it that next step, right? In terms of how did I come upon to have this land? How did my parents get this land, right? And have it as theirs and own it, as property. And so I didn't grow up with that idea either, right? It was like we'd been, my actual ancestors had been erased, right? Just leaving remnants.
In terms of my family lineage, in 1, 2, 3 generations, I guess, they've all been a part of the story of colonization in Canada. In the 1850s, there was a whole migration of Scots that came to southern Ontario, up around Huron County, and populated it. And that's all been treated. And they populated it as a result of treaties being signed with the people in that area. So they were living on Indian land. And that generation, back in those days, they had lots of kids, big families, just to support the work of the farm, eh? But of course, when the kids got bigger, they wanted their own land. So there was a subsequent migration. The next generation, my grandfather, out to Manitoba in the 1880s, after the treaties had been signed in the 1870s, so my grandfather and his brother traveled out to Manitoba, just south of Riding Mountain National Park, off the Yellowhead Highway now, and homesteaded, were given land, and were the dominant people in what became a little town, Angusville.
I have ancestors who came to the United States as settlers and colonizers, and they participated in colonialism by buying lands that were obtained by the government in unethical ways, and buying those lands very cheaply, and after they bought the land, doing what they, like there's this farming term that they call breaking the land, which I just find really, it sounds very violent. And this is what they did. They, I'm sure that there was a lot of destruction that was done by my ancestors on the lands that they farmed. And I know that I also have ancestors who participated in the logging industry, and I'm imagining that they were logging old growth forests in what's now called Wisconsin. So they settled on the lands of Anishinaabe people, and before those lands were where Anishinaabe people lived, Dakota people had lived there. And also I have ancestors who settled in Nebraska, in the lands of the Omaha Nation there.
I think that they probably perceive the Indigenous people of the land as less than human, and according to scripture, they were here to dominate and rule over them, so they had every right in their own minds to push them off the land, to kill them, to change them however they wanted, and so they stole this land and then became wealthy on it.
We just didn't end up here by accident, even though I didn't come from, ancestors who were educated or wealthy or anything like that, come from very sort of like peasant roots, no education, maybe grade 3 in some cases, that kind of thing, right? But they still were able to farm on land that, right? So you have to, and none of this happened by accident. Whatever flyer made its way down to the Ukraine that got somebody on a boat, saying that there's free land in Canada to have for whoever wanted to work it. They, worked their butts off fine. No one's going to say they didn't, but, they were able to do that on land, that of course was, effectively stolen from other people, right? So, and now I'm here 4 or 5 generations later, and still have my nice little parcel of land that I'm living on.
it was when we adopted Abby that we recognized that the very lands that my parents and grandparents were welcomed onto were the lands that her grandparents were dispossessed of. In 1920s, they were contemplating draining a lake in between Abbotsford and Sardis, Sumas Lake there. They were going to drain it in order to make farmland, and the local Stalo peoples were resisting that and saying, no, like, this is where we live. They had villages around the lake. They even had homes and fishing sites built on that lake on stilts. And that's where my daughter's great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents lived, right on that lake, right around it. And so they were dispossessed, removed. No doubt many of them ended up at Kokalitsa Residential School right there in Sardis.
When you think about it, all the things that happened to us, the legacy, and to occupy us and to separate us from our lands. We were land-based people. When they named those lakes, they fished in those lakes. When they walked in the mountains, when they went to pick their medicines, they knew where they were going. They knew what they were doing.
I'm also a descendant of a removed community in 1907 that still endures that legacy, still exists, very much struggles with the violence that happened to us when we were forcibly removed off our lands so that Manitoba could move in all of these farmers into our territories. And I started to learn about why there were Native people in Selkirk. I always wondered why. Why are there Native people in this town? And all of them were ironically north of Manitoba Avenue. All the Indigenous people that I knew. And so all of my auntie, my uncle, everyone lived on the north side of Manitoba Avenue. And that's because people had moved into town when they were removed, or when they moved in from the north, they moved to either the cheapest area or the area where that was my father grew up, and that's where the place where all the Indians kind of lived.
We did some research recently, and of course there was very little written about who lived on the land before the Mennonites. But there was talk about conflict between the Mennonite farmers and the Aboriginal people in the area. And I know from other texts that weren't specific to that particular spot that the Aboriginal people were farming in that area at one time and were kind of legally pushed off the land by the government, who started making rules to make it impossible for them to survive as farmers there. And then that land was given to the Mennonite community, which is my husband's family, who became quite wealthy as a result. And the Aboriginal people in that area are now relegated to the reserves, and the two communities don't mix.
The neighborhood that I live in is very close and sort of borders on a community that is referred to as Rooster Town. There's a sort of a primarily Métis community that was here, especially from the late 20s to the late 50s, and then was forcibly removed and displaced by the city of Winnipeg. So when I walk around, outside of this home, I'm, the more I learn about that particular history, in addition to, the Indigenous peoples that were here before that particular group as well, it just really, it shrinks history down or makes it very close to me. So even though my ancestors came over decades and decades ago, it doesn't feel like that time is that great to me at all. Like, it feels like it's very present and very now.
I am the third generation Canadian on this land. And on paper and according to our government, I own land here, and force would be used if it was ever contested. That's how the system works.
When I learned about the removal, when I learned about the violent history of dispossession, when I learned about how the treaties had been treated in the Selkirk area, I suddenly understood that history. The light bulb kind of went off for me, and I went, now I understood what I grew up with. When I look at a building, we're at the beautiful campus of the University of Manitoba. We're in this really beautiful city of Winnipeg, and we're in this beautiful place originally called Manitowabo, and this beautiful place, formerly called as Kanata, and I see such pain and such devastation and such violence that's taken place for these things to be what they are now. And I see these things as so sick, so full of, these buildings right here are washed with the blood of the people that were removed in order for this place to be. I tell my students, what does Pembina Highway mean? And this highway that comes right here. And they can't tell me. Nobody knows what that highway means. And that highway, which was created by Métis trade, and so then, and the Métis fiercely fight for this territory. They were fighting because this was who they are. This is who their livelihood, their being, every part of is in every blade of grass, and is in the names of this place, is in the wind.
So I've traveled, I've sat with many nations and ceremonied with them, but also heard their stories of the sacredness of their lands, their waters, their lakes, their streams, some of the elements there and what it means to them, what it means to their nation. So I got the privilege of sitting with them and hearing that sacred connection, of knowing this is where I came from.
We can't do all of this on our own. It's not all on our shoulders. And people want to put it on all our shoulders. People want us to solve everything. Solve your problem. It's your problem. You solve it. It's like, no. This isn't our problem, right? This isn't the Indian problem. This is a problem of the land, right? This is a problem of this place that we now call Canada.
And in some ways a good starting point, for me anyway, is to try to go back and know as much about, as a settler, the ancestors of settlers, the land that you're living on now and the history of it, and who lived there before, and what exactly transpired to make it so that they are not living here now in the ways in which they did previously. And my take on this is that if everyone in the country we call Canada did this, if all non-Indigenous people did this, we would just be miles ahead in this great project.
It really is supporting Indigenous struggles and resurgence around land, if that is the foundation. Murray Sinclair says this, your responsibility is to repair what was broken, to return what is lost. Like, that's huge, right? But you begin small. You get to know your place that you're in.
This is not an Indigenous issue. We talk about Aboriginal issues. This is a Canadian issue. We did not put ourselves where we're at today. And in order to change things, you have to know where you came from and where you're going. And that takes honesty.
That sense of where I come from has always been really solid and firmly rooted on the banks of this river and in this part of Manitoba. And you know, it's interesting, I picked up my great-grandfather's oral history, and you know, my family has been here for many generations along this river, and I got that strong sense of understanding better why I feel the way I feel about this place, and why, for example, when I go away to work or study, that I feel this pull back here, and that there's certain things that I can only do when I'm sitting on this land. As much as I love other places and other people, there's something truly firmly rooted in this place for me. So.
Address what is real, connected to the land, we are one with each other. This is our home to discover.